Psychologist Robert Ford, well known and respected in New York City, began his morning like any other. The aroma of fresh coffee filled his office as he adjusted his glasses, preparing for his first sessions of the day. For years he had been the safe harbor for many patients, a man capable of unraveling the complexities of the human mind with almost unsettling precision. There was no psychological challenge he couldn't understand and often solve. It was a Tuesday, and the sun was still struggling to break through the office blinds. Ford had no idea that today would change his life forever. When the phone rang, he didn't hesitate to answer. "Dr. Ford, this is Sally from your office. The mail came, a letter for you. No return address." "Strange, isn't it? I left it on your desk." "Thank you, Sally. I'll keep an eye on it," Ford replied, suspicious of anything other than a professional document or recommendation. He knew that his life was constantly being observed by eager patients and admirers, but a letter with no return address was something new. When he reached his office, he found the envelope on his desk, the red seal the only detail, no names or addresses. Without further hesitation, he cut the edge of the envelope with precision, pulling out an aged, yellowed sheet of paper, handwritten with perfect, almost artistic handwriting. "The game has begun. Find the riddle before it finds you. But be careful, Robert. It's not what it seems." Ford felt a shiver run down his spine. It was a simple message, but loaded with a tension he couldn't ignore. He looked around as if someone were watching him, but there was no one. The office was empty, just him and his mind, which was now restless. Slowly he settled into his chair and began to think. He knew the phrase was more than just a simple threat. It was charged with something more, something personal. But what did "find the riddle" mean? And who knew enough about him to send such an enigmatic message? Robert had never been one to fall into paranoia. He believed the human mind had an explanation for everything, a logical and scientific reason for every action. But this made no sense. As much as curiosity consumed him, he decided to wait. What else could he do? He knew that in time the pieces would fall into place. All he needed was one more clue. Then the second letter arrived. It was a Friday, a week after the first, and the letter was there on the same desk, exactly where the first one had been. Ford furrowed his brow, but before he even touched it, he already knew it was the same person. The sender remained unknown, but the challenge was escalating. "Do you think you can solve the riddle?" "Let's test your skills, Dr. Ford. When you reach the truth, it will be too late to turn back." The text contained no further details, but the threat was clear. Ford looked at the letter once again, trying to understand what was happening. He knew he couldn't ignore this. Something was wrong, and his mind, which had always been capable of predicting, was now being tested. But by whom? His first impulse was to follow up, investigate, and try to understand. But as the days passed and the letters multiplied, something else began to form inside him. The feeling that he was being tested by something or someone who knew more than they should about his life, about his history. In the third letter, the riddle became more complex. The paper contained a code, something that seemed simple at first, but soon revealed itself to be a complicated puzzle. Robert, so used to deciphering the complexities of the human mind, began to realize that the riddle wasn't just logical. It was emotional, too, and that made him uneasy. After all, what did he really know about his own feelings, about his own choices? What happened in his mind when there were no easy answers? He began to question himself more intensely. Who was the person behind these letters? And what did they know about him that even he didn't? With each letter, a piece of his mind seemed to unravel. With every clue, a part of the past emerged, things he preferred to keep hidden, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being manipulated. But he didn't know by whom. Robert couldn't deny it. The game had begun, and he didn't know how to get out. He then did something he never thought necessary. He checked the records of his oldest patients, looking for any clue that might link the letters to his practice. The tension was building, and he knew that soon he would have to confront whatever awaited him. But he wasn't prepared for what he was about to discover. Robert sent a quick glance toward the clock. The hands had barely moved, but the minutes felt heavier. A week had passed since the second letter had arrived, and in that time the puzzle had only grown more complex. Each new message came with riddles, codes, and obscure references to his past things only someone who knew him intimately could understand. It wasn't just a game anymore. It was a direct assault on his mind, on his very foundation. The office, which had once been his sanctuary, now felt like a prison. He couldn't focus. Each time he tried to attend to a patient, the letters seemed to hover in the back of his mind. What did they mean? Who was behind them? Was it a patient seeking revenge? Or worse, someone from his past? The most unsettling part was that the riddles seemed to have personal implications, as if they were calling into question his professional ethics, the choices he had made throughout his career. Robert had always prided himself on his objectivity, his ability to maintain distance from his patients, to avoid getting emotionally entangled. But these letters were forcing him to confront the very boundaries he had worked so hard to establish. It wasn't until the fourth letter arrived that the tone shifted. The handwriting was still the same, but the words were sharper, more direct. The envelope was thicker this time, heavier, as though it carried something of significance. As Robert tore it open, his hands trembled, not out of fear, but out of anticipation. Inside, there was a single folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it slowly, scanning the contents. Do you remember the first time you made a choice for someone else? A choice that cost them everything? You thought it was for the best, but now I wonder, who was it really for? The words cut deeper than he expected. Robert's mind raced. He didn't have to think hard to recall the memory the letter was referring to. It was one of the most pivotal moments in his career, a decision that had haunted him for years. A patient named Aaron Miller, a young man he had treated for severe depression. Aaron had been struggling with suicidal thoughts, and Robert had decided that the best course of action was to institutionalize him. Against his will, despite Aaron's protests. At the time, Robert had justified the decision, believing that Aaron was incapable of making rational choices for himself. But now, looking back, he wondered if he had overstepped, if he had made that choice based on his own arrogance rather than what was truly best for Aaron. Aaron had never forgiven him. In fact, Robert had lost contact with him shortly after that. The memory of Aaron's face, full of anger and betrayal, flooded his mind. Had this been the trigger? Was Aaron the one behind the letters? The question gnawed at him, but Robert didn't have answers. Only more questions. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Aaron wasn't the only person from his past who could be behind this. There were other patients, other decisions he had made, other lives he had impacted in ways that were far from perfect. Robert ran his fingers through his hair, trying to steady himself. He needed to think clearly. The letters had to mean something more, something deeper. This wasn't just about Aaron, it couldn't be. There was a bigger game at play. For the next few days, he immersed himself in the records of his past patients. He went through case after case, revisiting decisions, evaluating outcomes. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, tracking his every move. Every decision, every patient he had ever seen, seemed to be under scrutiny. The more he searched, the more he began to realize something unsettling. The person behind the letters knew him intimately, perhaps better than he knew himself. The riddles, the references to his past, all seemed to point toward someone who had been a part of his life long ago, someone whose existence he had buried deep within his mind. As Robert sat at his desk, surrounded by patient files, the phone rang again. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he hesitated. Was it another letter? Or was it someone else? Someone he hadn't heard from in years? He picked up the phone, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "Dr. Ford speaking. Is this Dr. Robert Ford?" The voice on the other end was calm, controlled, and unmistakable. "Aaron?" Robert's voice faltered. There was a brief pause, and then Aaron's voice, older but still laced with bitterness, replied, "You don't remember, do you? The decision you made for me, Robert? You thought you knew what was best for me. Well, now I'm here to show you just how wrong you were." Robert felt the weight of those words settle over him like a thick fog. The realization hit him hard. Aaron Miller had been the one sending the letters. But why now? Why after all these years? Aaron continued, his voice dripping with resentment. "You didn't just ruin my life, Robert. You ruined yours, too. And now I'm going to make you face the consequences of your actions. You think you're in control? You're not. This is my game now, and you're just a pawn." The line went dead. Robert sat there, the receiver still in his hand, his mind racing. He had been right. Aaron was the one behind the letters. But what did Aaron mean by "this is my game now"? What consequences was he talking about? Robert had no choice but to play along. He had to find a way to stop this madness before it completely consumed him. But as he stared at the phone in his hand, he realized something else. The letters weren't just about Aaron anymore. This was bigger, much bigger, and he was just beginning to understand how deep the rabbit hole really went. Robert felt trapped, as if he had lost the ability to distinguish between what was real and what was just part of a twisted manipulation. After Aaron's call, he tried to resume his routine, but the mental pressure was becoming unbearable. Every step he took felt calculated, anticipated, and he no longer knew how to act. Paranoia was deeply rooting itself in his mind. He revisited Aaron Miller's file, trying to find any clue that could explain this vengeance. But what he found was even more alarming. In one of his last sessions, Aaron had mentioned a disturbing ID as something Robert had ignored at the time. He had spoken about playing the game and manipulating the pieces. At the time, Robert had thought it was just a metaphor for the therapeutic process, but now it seemed clear that those words held a much darker meaning. Robert knew something bigger was at play. The letters, the riddles, the veiled messages in the phone calls. Everything was connecting in a chilling way. But who else was involved in this? Aaron couldn't be the only one responsible. There was something else, a web of manipulation and control that extended beyond the confines of his office. With no other options left, Robert decided to confront Aaron directly. Perhaps by understanding the motivations behind this vengeance, he could somehow regain control. He searched for Aaron, trying to locate his whereabouts. But what he found was even more disturbing. The next day a new letter arrived. This time there were no words, just a photograph. A photo of his own office, with the window perfectly visible, as if someone had taken the picture from inside the very office. Robert felt a chill run down his spine. He was being watched. Without hesitation, he grabbed his phone and made an urgent call to the police. He needed help. It was clear that something far more sinister was happening, something that went beyond the simple resentment of a patient. When the police arrived, Robert explained the situation, but the officers seemed unconvinced that the problem was serious enough to warrant an immediate investigation. They suggested he take personal precautions like altering his routine and avoiding being so vulnerable. But for Robert, the situation was beyond simple precautions. He was being manipulated, and not just by Aaron. There was something darker behind it all. One night, alone in his office, Robert realized that he needed to critically examine his own psyche. It was the only path left. He grabbed a piece of paper and began to write. Perhaps by putting his thoughts on paper, he could organize them, find a clue that would lead him to understand what was happening. He wrote, "Who is really the manipulator here? Me with my decisions, or the person behind these letters? When I finished therapy with Aaron, I was sure he was on the road to recovery. But was I just trying to relieve my own guilt? Was there more there, something I missed?" He stopped, staring at the paper for a long moment. It was a valid question, and the answer was becoming clearer as the days went by. He couldn't ignore the fact that the mental challenges he was facing were deeply connected to his own insecurities and fears, issues he had never fully addressed in his career. He was being challenged to confront his own failures, and the most unsettling thing was that somehow he had allowed this to happen. In the following days, he began to isolate himself even further, trying to understand his own limitations as a psychologist, his mistakes and flaws as a professional. During his sessions with other patients, he felt a growing sense of detachment, as if he were about to fall into an emotional abyss. Not only were Aaron's letters affecting his sanity, but he also felt that his own choices had fueled the fire of this vengeance. It was then that Robert began to question whether Aaron's true revenge was not just to destabilize him emotionally, but to force him to confront his own errors in judgment. Perhaps Aaron had found a way to manipulate not just the situations around him, but Robert's very psychological limits. At that moment, the twist became clear. The letters, the riddles, the threats, everything was part of a game that Robert could never have predicted. He wasn't just being manipulated by Aaron. He was being manipulated by doubt itself, by a lack of self-confidence and the mistakes he had made as a psychologist. And deep down he knew that by engaging in this psychological game, he was beginning to lose more than just control over his own mind. He was losing something far more important, his own identity. The days blurred together for Robert. He spent sleepless nights reviewing his past cases, his notes, and even his personal life, searching for any possible link that could explain why Aaron had come back to torment him. But the more he searched, the more he realized that this wasn't just about Aaron anymore. It was about his entire career. Robert had dedicated his life to understanding the human mind, yet he had never once considered how his own personal biases, his own blind spots, had shaped his work. He had been so focused on helping others that he had neglected his own well-being and professional integrity. This realization, although painful, was the closest thing to an answer he could find, but it still didn't explain why Aaron was targeting him. He thought back to the first time he had met Aaron Miller. It was years ago in the small, sterile office of his private practice. Aaron had been a young man, no older than 22, with a fragile demeanor and a haunted look in his eyes. He had come to Robert seeking help for what he described as deep, unrelenting anxiety and an overwhelming sense of guilt that clung to him like a second skin. At the time, Robert had been eager to help. He had listened patiently, diagnosed Aaron with generalized anxiety disorder, and recommended a course of therapy. The sessions had gone on for several months, and at first they seemed to be making progress. Aaron appeared to be opening up, confronting his past, and finding ways to cope with his anxiety. But then, suddenly, things had taken a turn. Aaron stopped showing up to appointments. His calls became less frequent, and soon Robert had lost contact with him altogether. Robert had been disappointed but not overly concerned. After all, it wasn't uncommon for patients to abandon therapy, especially when it became too difficult to face their issues head-on. What Robert hadn't known, however, was that Aaron had never truly left. Instead, he had retreated into the shadows, quietly building resentment and nurturing a need for revenge that would fester for years. Now, years later, it all made sense. The letters, the cryptic messages, the unsettling photographs, it was Aaron's way of dragging Robert back into the past. It was as if he were trying to force Robert to relive everything he had failed to understand or address during their therapy sessions. Every riddle, every challenge felt like a piece of Aaron's torment that Robert had unknowingly triggered. Robert's heart raced as the weight of the situation sank in. He could no longer afford to treat this as a mere game or a harmless vendetta. Aaron's mind was a labyrinth, and Robert was stuck in it, unable to escape. What did Aaron want from him? What could he possibly gain by destroying Robert's sense of self and sanity? It was then that Robert realized something chilling. Aaron wasn't just seeking revenge on him, he was seeking validation for his pain. Aaron wanted Robert to acknowledge the harm he had caused, to face the consequences of his own decisions, and perhaps to apologize for not being able to help him fully. But Robert knew he couldn't give Aaron that. He couldn't admit to something he hadn't done. He had helped Aaron in the best way he knew how, but somewhere along the way, he had failed to see the cracks in Aaron's psyche. Now those cracks were widening into an abyss, and Robert was being pulled into it. The next day another letter arrived, but this time it was different. It wasn't the usual cryptic message or photograph. It was a plain, typed letter with a single sentence. "If you want to end this, you know where to find me." No return address, no further clues, just those words hanging in the air like a threat. Robert's pulse quickened. The time had come. This was no longer a game of puzzles and riddles. Aaron was no longer testing him. He was daring Robert to face him. Robert knew that confronting Aaron was the only way out. But the question was, could he confront his own guilt and failures head-on without losing everything? Robert couldn't shake the feeling that he had reached a point of no return. The letter that arrived the previous day was a direct challenge, a message that left no room for ambiguity. Aaron had made it clear if Robert wanted to end this torment, he needed to meet him face to face. For a long moment, Robert considered calling the police. But he knew that this wasn't something the authorities could handle. This wasn't just a case of stalking or harassment. This was personal, something that transcended legal boundaries. It was a psychological battle, one that only he could fight. He sat in his office, staring at the letter in his hands. He had no idea where to find Aaron, but he knew that somehow the pieces of the puzzle were pointing him in the right direction. He had to confront Aaron. He had to finally face whatever it was that had been haunting him all these years. The night before, Robert had spent hours replaying his sessions with Aaron in his mind. He could still remember the look in Aaron's eyes, the vulnerability that had made him believe he was helping. But now, with the clarity of hindsight, he realized that Aaron's pain had been far deeper than he had understood, and Robert's inability to truly see Aaron's suffering had planted the seeds for this elaborate revenge. Despite the dread that coursed through him, Robert made up his mind. He would find Aaron, and he would end this, even if it meant confronting the darkest parts of his own psyche. He gathered his things and left the office, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. He didn't know where to begin, but he had an inkling. Aaron had always been drawn to isolation. He had never been one to seek out company or share his problems with others. Robert had often wondered if that isolation had contributed to his patient's downfall. Robert went to Aaron's last known address, a small apartment on the edge of town. When he arrived, he was met with an eerie silence. The place seemed abandoned, though the lights were on in a few of the windows. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He knocked again, harder this time, and the door creaked open slightly, as if someone on the other side was waiting for him to enter. He stepped inside cautiously, his heart pounding. The apartment was dark, and the air felt thick with tension. He called out for Aaron, but there was no response. His eyes scanned the room, and that's when he saw it, on the table, a familiar object, a single piece of paper with a riddle written on it. You think you've solved the puzzle, but the final piece is yet to come. Robert's stomach churned as he realized that this was no ordinary confrontation. It wasn't going to be over just because he showed up. Aaron had been playing him all along, leading him to this moment. He continued searching the apartment, but there was no sign of Aaron. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Robert felt the walls close in around him. This wasn't a game anymore. This was a trap, and he had walked straight into it. As he turned to leave, he heard a soft sound, a whisper, almost imperceptible. He froze, his pulse racing, his mind working overtime to process what was happening. He spun around, but there was still no sign of Aaron, just the empty apartment, and the chilling feeling that he wasn't alone. Suddenly, a door slammed open behind him. He turned just in time to see a figure step out from the shadows. It was Aaron, but he wasn't the broken man Robert had once known. He was cold, calculating, and utterly composed. There was no trace of the vulnerable patient who had once sat in Robert's office. You came, Aaron said, his voice low and even. I knew you would. You always have to play the hero, don't you? Robert swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. This has to stop, Aaron. Whatever this is, whatever game you're playing, it ends now. Aaron laughed softly, a humorless sound that sent chills down Robert's spine. You don't get it, do you? This was never about you helping me. This was always about you. About your failures, your mistakes, your guilt. Robert took a step forward. I did what I could. You knew that. I tried to help you. Aaron shook his head, his smile cruel. No, Robert. You didn't. You couldn't. You never really saw me. You never understood what I was going through, and now you're going to pay for that. Robert felt a wave of guilt wash over him. Was Aaron right? Had he failed his patient? Had he been too wrapped up in his own life to truly understand the depth of Aaron's pain? The questions were relentless, gnawing at him, but he couldn't afford to doubt himself now. I won't play your game, Aaron, Robert said, his voice firmer now. This ends tonight. Aaron's eyes gleamed with something dark, something Robert couldn't quite place. We'll see about that. And then, in an instant, everything changed. The air in the apartment seemed to grow thicker with every passing second. Robert's pulse was racing, but his mind was sharp. He had been trained for moments like this, moments where the situation seemed to spiral out of control. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. Aaron stood there, in the shadows, his face a mask of calm. But beneath the surface, Robert could feel the tension, the weight of the years of resentment Aaron had been harboring. It wasn't just a game anymore. It was a battle for dominance, for control. You think you can just end this, don't you? Aaron said, his voice soft but filled with menace. You think you can walk away and pretend none of this ever happened. That's what you've always done, isn't it, Robert? Run away from your mistakes, from the people you've hurt. Robert took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This isn't about me. It's about you. Aaron, this obsession, these games, it's all about punishing me for something I couldn't control. Aaron smirked. That's the problem, Robert. You've always been so quick to blame others. But deep down, you know the truth. You couldn't save me. You failed just like you failed so many others. The words hit Robert harder than he expected. For a brief moment he felt a flicker of doubt, a reminder of all the patience he had tried and failed to help over the years. Had he really done enough? Had he truly made a difference in any of their lives? Or had he just been going through the motions, giving them answers that felt right, but never truly understanding their pain? Aaron took a step forward, closing the distance between them. You should have seen it, Robert. The signs were all there. But you were too busy with your own life, too busy with your career. You never took the time to really understand me. And now you're going to pay for it. Robert's heart raced. He knew that confronting Aaron was the only way to end this, but the darkness in Aaron's eyes was unsettling. There was something almost methodical about the way he spoke, the way he moved. It was clear that this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about proving something, about showing Robert how powerless he truly was. You've spent all these years building up this version of me in your head, Robert said, trying to regain some sense of control. But the truth is, you don't know me. You don't know what I've been through, what I've sacrificed. You've only seen what you wanted to see. Aaron laughed, a cold, hollow sound. I know exactly who you are, Robert. You're a man who hides behind his credentials, his reputation. But at the end of the day, you're just like everyone else, weak, afraid, and you're going to lose. You've already lost. Robert's hands clenched into fists, his mind racing for a way out of this. He couldn't let Aaron control the narrative anymore. He had to fight back, to take control of the situation before it completely consumed him. Without warning, Aaron lunged forward, grabbing Robert by the collar and slamming him against the wall. Robert gasped, the impact knocking the air out of his lungs. For a moment, everything went black as his mind spun, trying to process what was happening. But then, as if in slow motion, he registered Aaron's words. "You still don't get it, do you?" Aaron hissed. "You never understood the power you had over me. But now I'm the one holding the strings. I'm the one in control. And you," he paused, letting the words hang in the air like a threat. "You're nothing but a puppet." Robert struggled to free himself, but Aaron's grip was like iron. He tried to push against the wall, but it was no use. His mind raced, looking for any possible escape, any way to regain control of the situation. "Aaron, please," Robert said, his voice strained. "This isn't you. This isn't how it's supposed to end. We can fix this." But Aaron just shook his head, his expression cold and unyielding. "No, Robert, it's too late for that." Suddenly the grip on his collar loosened, and Robert collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. He looked up at Aaron, who was now standing over him, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Robert tried to stand, but his legs felt weak. He couldn't let Aaron see him like this, vulnerable, powerless. He had to regain his composure, had to find a way out. But then Aaron spoke again, his voice low and almost thoughtful. "You know, Robert," he said, "I've been thinking a lot about your career, about all those people you've helped, all the lives you've touched. But I wonder how many of them were really helped. Or did they just fall through the cracks like I did?" The words cut through Robert like a knife. He had always prided himself on his work, on the people he had helped over the years. But now, with Aaron's words hanging in the air, he couldn't help but question everything. Was he really the man he thought he was? Or was he just another flawed human being trying to make up for his mistakes? As the silence hung between them, Robert felt a shiver run down his spine. The real game had begun. The tension in the room was suffocating. Robert sat on the floor, his head spinning from the events of the past few hours. He tried to steady his breathing, but the weight of Aaron's words lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the depths to which this game had sunk. Aaron had retreated to the corner of the room, his eyes cold, calculating. Robert's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. What was Aaron really after? Revenge was part of it, but there had to be more. Aaron was playing a long game, and Robert was starting to realize that he had been a pawn all along. "You think you've got me cornered, don't you?" Robert said, his voice hoarse but defiant. He stood up slowly, his legs still shaking, but he refused to let Aaron see his weakness. He had to fight back somehow. Aaron didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Robert's. There was a strange look in his eyes, a mixture of disdain and something darker, something Robert couldn't quite place. He couldn't afford to let his guard down now, not when the stakes were higher than they had ever been. "I'm not after revenge, Robert," Aaron said, his voice softer now but no less dangerous. "I'm after something far more valuable. Something you'll never understand." Robert frowned, his heart pounding. "What's that? What do you want from me?" Aaron's lips curled into a cold smile. "I want you to face the truth about who you really are, the truth about how much you've destroyed in your quest for power, for control, You never realized how much damage you caused, did you? You never looked beyond your own little world. And now you'll see." Robert's mind reeled as the pieces slowly began to fall into place. Aaron had always been a patient man, a master of manipulation. But this was something else. The way Aaron was speaking now, it wasn't just about exposing Robert's flaws. It was about breaking him down completely. "You think you're the only one who's suffered?" Robert said, his voice shaking with a mix of frustration and anger. "You think you're the only one who's had to face difficult choices? I've spent my life trying to help people, trying to fix things. I didn't always succeed, but I never gave up." Aaron chuckled, the sound bitter and full of contempt. "Help people? You didn't help anyone, Robert. You played your part in a system that's broken. You gave people false hope, made them think they were being fixed when all you did was push them further down the same path. You didn't help anyone, you just created more victims." Robert recoiled, the weight of Aaron's words hitting him harder than anything physical. He had spent his entire career trying to make a difference, trying to heal people. But now, standing in the shadow of Aaron's accusations, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe Aaron was right. Maybe he had been so focused on his career, on his own success, that he had missed the real damage he was causing. "No," Robert whispered, shaking his head as if trying to clear the thoughts from his mind. "No, that's not true. I helped people. I made a difference." Aaron's expression remained cold, almost pitying. "You're lying to yourself, Robert. You always have been. You're just like the rest of them, blind, arrogant. And now you'll see what it feels like to be the one who's powerless." Robert took a step back, his mind reeling. The walls were closing in around him. Every word Aaron spoke seemed to twist the knife deeper, making him question everything he had believed in, everything he had worked for. But there was something else, something deeper. Robert could feel it now. The way Aaron was speaking, it wasn't just about Robert's past. It was about Aaron's own twisted need for validation, his desperate desire to prove that he had been right all along. Aaron wanted to break Robert down, yes, but more than that, he wanted to make Robert feel the same helplessness that Aaron had felt all those years ago. And that was something Robert couldn't allow. He couldn't let Aaron win, not like this. Not after everything he had been through. "Why are you doing this?" "Aaron?" Robert asked, his voice low but determined. "What do you want from me?" Aaron's eyes narrowed, his gaze sharp and calculating. "I want you to understand. I want you to realize the truth, that you're just as broken as everyone else, that no matter how much you try to fix people, you'll never fix yourself." The silence between them was deafening. Robert's mind raced, trying to process the enormity of what was happening. He had been so focused on solving the puzzles, on trying to outsmart Aaron, that he had failed to see the bigger picture. Aaron wasn't just trying to destroy him, he was trying to make him face the one thing Robert had always avoided, the truth. "You're wrong," Robert said, his voice trembling but firm. "I'm not broken. I'm just human, and that means I can change. I can do better." Aaron's lips twitched into a cruel smile. "We'll see about that." The game was far from over, and now Robert realized it was time to face the final challenge. But would he have the strength to survive it? Or would Aaron's relentless pursuit of truth finally break him? Robert's head ached as he left the sterile walls of his office. The weight of Aaron's words lingered like a fog, clouding his thoughts and draining his energy. He had spent years building his career on the belief that he was helping people, fixing broken lives one person at a time. But Aaron had shattered that illusion, piece by piece, until all that was left was the raw truth. He had never really fixed anyone at all. He had only been a part of a broken system. The streets outside were busy, but Robert felt alone. The hustle and bustle of the city seemed distant, as if it were happening in another world, one where he no longer belonged. He had never been one to doubt himself, but now, with every step, he felt the ground beneath him shift. Every passer-by seemed like a reminder of how far he had fallen from the man he thought he was. He needed to get away, to think, to breathe. The sound of a ringing phone broke through his thoughts. Robert looked at the screen, surprised to see an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Robert," came the voice on the other end. It was Aaron. "Why are you calling me?" Robert's voice was cold, his patience worn thin. "I told you before," Aaron said, his voice calm but edged with something darker. "This isn't over." "I don't want to talk to you," Robert replied sharply. "You've already said everything you need to say. You think this is just about what I've told you?" Aaron's voice grew more intense, more insistent. "This is about you. This is about everything you've done. You can't run from it, not anymore." "I'm not running," Robert snapped, his temper flaring. "I've been trying to fix things. I've been trying to make amends." Aaron's laugh echoed through the phone, hollow and mocking. "Fix things? You can't fix what's already broken. You can't undo what's been done. And you can't change who you really are." The words hit Robert like a punch in the gut. He felt himself choking on them, unable to breathe. The anger that had been bubbling inside him for days now erupted. But it wasn't just anger. It was frustration. It was helplessness. It was a realization that despite all the years of work, of dedication, he couldn't escape the truth. He couldn't escape Aaron. "I've tried to be a good man," Robert said, his voice cracking. "I've tried to help people. You don't know what it's been like. You have no idea how hard I've worked." "I know exactly what it's been like," Aaron shot back. "You think I'm the one with the problems? You think I'm the one who's broken? Look at yourself, Robert. You're the one who's been lying all along, lying to your patients, lying to yourself." "I never lied to my patients," Robert shouted, his voice trembling with anger and disbelief. "Oh, but you did." Aaron's voice was almost a whisper now, a cold, cutting whisper. "Every time you gave them hope, every time you told them they could get better, you lied, and now you're going to pay for it." Robert slammed his fist against the side of the building, the sound of it echoing in the empty alley. He could feel the heat rising in his chest. But it wasn't just anger anymore. It was desperation. He had to end this. He had to stop Aaron before it was too late. "I'm done with this," Robert said, taking a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I won't play your game anymore." "Too late," Aaron replied, the finality in his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "The game's already over. You're already too far gone." With that, the line went dead. Robert stood in the alley, his heart pounding in his chest. The air felt thick, suffocating. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run. But more than anything, he wanted to understand. He wanted to know what Aaron's next move would be. What was the next challenge? What was the next truth he would be forced to face? He couldn't keep running from this. He had to confront Aaron. He had to face whatever it was that Aaron wanted to show him. And more than that, he had to find a way to take control again. He couldn't let Aaron have the final word. The thought of his own brokenness, his inability to fix himself, hung over him like a dark cloud. But it wasn't enough to break him, not yet. He wasn't ready to let go of everything he had worked for. Not yet. The pieces were still there, scattered all around him, and it was up to him to put them back together. But as the hours passed, Robert began to realize that maybe he didn't have to do it alone. Maybe it was time to bring in someone else. Robert spent days trying to piece together the fragments of his life, trying to make sense of the challenges Aaron had set before him. The overwhelming weight of guilt was suffocating. But as time passed, something shifted. The questions he had avoided for so long, questions about his own choices, his career, and the patients he had worked with, began to rise to the surface, demanding his attention. He had always considered himself a professional, a man who had mastered his emotions and controlled his reactions. But Aaron's words were slowly unraveling the facade he had so carefully constructed over the years. And now, with every passing moment, Robert felt more and more like a man on the edge, about to fall into a dark abyss. The phone call had rattled him, but it also gave him something he hadn't had in a long time. A sense of urgency. He needed to do something. He couldn't just sit around waiting for Aaron's next move. He had to take control, to turn the tables before it was too late. He reached out to an old colleague, a former therapist named Dr. Evelyn Westbrook. They had worked together in the early days of Robert's career, and while their paths had diverged since then, she was still someone he trusted. Evelyn listened carefully as Robert recounted the events of the past few days, his voice tinged with frustration and desperation. "Robert," she said gently after a long pause, "you're not just dealing with someone who wants revenge. You're dealing with someone who knows you, perhaps better than you know yourself. This is about more than just you and Aaron. This is about something deeper, something you've been avoiding." Robert felt a shiver run down his spine. Evelyn's words hit too close to home. She was right. Aaron wasn't just trying to expose Robert's mistakes. He was digging into the very core of who Robert was, questioning everything he had built. "I've been trying to fix people," Robert said, his voice barely a whisper. "But maybe I've been ignoring the truth about myself. Maybe I've been lying to everyone, even myself." Evelyn's silence was heavy, but there was a note of sympathy in her voice when she finally spoke. "You've spent so long focusing on others that you've forgotten to look at yourself. But now it's time to face the truth. Aaron isn't just trying to hurt you. He's forcing you to confront what you've been running from for years." Robert stared out of the window, his mind racing. He had spent so much of his life helping others that he had never stopped to think about the cost. The emotional toll it had taken on him, the guilt, the self-doubt. He had buried those feelings deep, pushing them aside in favor of his professional success. But now Aaron was forcing him to dig it all up. "I don't know if I can face it," Robert admitted, his voice breaking. "I don't know if I can handle what I'll find." "You don't have to do it alone," Evelyn said softly. "You have people who care about you, and you have the strength within you to face whatever comes next. You've always been good at understanding others. Now it's time to understand yourself." Robert hung up the phone, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He felt the urge to reach out for help, but it was complicated. His pride, his fear of vulnerability, these things held him back. But Evelyn was right. He couldn't keep running from himself. He had to confront his own darkness, his own flaws. If he didn't, Aaron would win. And he couldn't allow that. The next morning, Robert decided to go to his office early. He needed to think, to be alone with his thoughts. The building was eerily quiet when he arrived, the fluorescent lights flickering above him as he sat down at his desk. The weight of the silence was suffocating, and for a moment he allowed himself to feel it, the loneliness, the isolation. He opened his email and saw that another message from Aaron had arrived. His heart raced as he clicked it open. The subject line was simple: "Time's up." Robert's hands trembled as he read the contents. "You think you're ready, but you're not. You can't escape your past. You can't outrun your mistakes. They've been following you, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment you would have to face them. That moment is now." The words were sharp, cutting into him like a blade. But there was something else in the message, something different from the previous ones. It wasn't just an accusation. It was a challenge. Robert leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Aaron wasn't just manipulating him. He was pushing him toward something, toward an inevitable confrontation with his own past. The question, though, remained, who was really in control here? Robert took a deep breath. He couldn't allow Aaron to have all the power. Not anymore. With a newfound resolve, he set the phone down and began to dig through his old case files, searching for the one thing that might finally give him the answers he needed. He had to find the connection, the thread that tied everything together. But as he sifted through the papers, something caught his eye, a familiar name. A patient from years ago, someone he had helped, or thought he had helped. The realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. It wasn't just Aaron he needed to confront. It was everything he had done, every choice he had made. And it was time to face the consequences. Robert sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. The name on the file before him, Daniel Brewer, had been buried deep in his memory for years. Daniel had been one of his earliest patients, a man who came to Robert with anger issues, a difficult past, and a deep sense of betrayal. At the time, Robert had felt a great deal of sympathy for him. Daniel's father had been a ruthless businessman, and his mother had been a distant figure, leaving Daniel to fend for himself. Robert remembered how hard Daniel had worked in therapy, how he had slowly opened up about the pain he carried, how he had slowly begun to rebuild his life. It had taken years of hard work, but eventually Daniel had seemed to find some peace. Robert had been proud of the progress Daniel had made, but what he hadn't known, what he could never have imagined, was that the peace Daniel had found was only an illusion. Robert's fingers hovered over the file, his mind racing with the implications. Daniel's therapy had ended long ago, and Robert had assumed he had moved on. He hadn't heard from him since, and he had never thought to look back. But now, as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, he realized how deeply he had misjudged Daniel's progress, how deeply he had misunderstood the situation. It all came rushing back now. The late-night sessions, the subtle manipulations. Daniel hadn't been seeking therapy to heal. He had been using Robert as a tool, as a means to an end. And now, years later, Robert was finally beginning to see the truth. He needed to confront Daniel. He needed to understand what had happened, what had gone wrong. The thought of facing Daniel again filled him with dread, but Robert knew it was the only way to break the cycle. If he didn't confront his past, he would never escape Aaron's trap. But how? How could he find Daniel, and what would he say when he did? Robert stood up abruptly, pacing the room. He could feel the walls closing in, the weight of everything he had hidden from himself finally catching up to him. But the path forward was clear. He had to go to Daniel, and he had to do it now. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Robert's heart skipped a beat as he glanced at the screen. An unknown number. He hesitated, but then picked up the phone. He had no time to waste. "Robert," came the voice on the other end. "I'm glad you finally remembered me." It was Daniel. The coldness in his voice sent a shiver down Robert's spine. "You've been running from this for years," Daniel continued. "I've been waiting for you to see the truth. You helped me, but you never understood what you were really doing." "You never understood me?" "I've tried to understand you," Robert said, his voice shaking. "I thought I helped you." "You didn't help me," Daniel replied, his voice growing darker. "You just made things worse. But now it's time to make you pay for your mistakes." Robert felt the room spin. "What do you want from me?" "You'll find out soon enough," Daniel said, his voice dripping with menace. "You're not in control, Robert. You never were. You're just a pawn in my game." Before Robert could respond, the line went dead. He stood there, frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear. What had just happened? What did Daniel mean by a pawn in my game? Robert's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the conversation. The pieces were coming together, but they didn't make any sense. What game was Daniel playing? What did he want from Robert? And then it hit him, Aaron. Aaron had been pulling the strings all along, but Daniel was the mastermind. He was the one who had set the trap. Aaron had been the messenger, but it was Daniel who was truly manipulating everything. Suddenly, Robert understood. The years of therapy, the years of building a successful career, it had all been a part of Daniel's plan. He had used Robert's compassion, his desire to help, to shape him into the person he was today. And now, Daniel wanted his revenge. The question now was simple. What was Robert going to do about it? He couldn't let Daniel win. He couldn't let this man continue to manipulate him. He had to take control, or he would lose everything. Robert grabbed his coat, his heart pounding in his chest. He was going to find Daniel, and he was going to end this once and for all. Robert's pulse quickened as he drove through the streets of the city, the darkness of the night pressing in on him. He had spent hours tracking down Daniel's last known address, and now his gut was telling him he was getting close to something dangerous. He had no idea what to expect when he confronted Daniel, but he knew it was inevitable. There was no running anymore. No more distractions. The cold air pressed against his face as he stepped out of his car, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about therapy or manipulation anymore. This was about power. It was about understanding who was truly in control and who had been played. Robert stood in front of the building, staring up at the dark windows. It was a nondescript office building, much like any other, but tonight it felt like the walls were closing in. He had spent so long running from his own past that he had never fully understood the man he had helped, or more accurately, the man who had used him. And now it was time to face the truth. As Robert entered the building, he felt a sense of unease settle over him. The hallways were empty, and the silence hung heavy in the air. His footsteps echoed through the corridor, each step feeling like a small betrayal of the person he had once been. At the end of the hallway, he found the door he had been looking for. It was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling into the darkness beyond. He hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. Daniel was sitting at a desk, his back to Robert, staring out the window. The air between them felt thick, charged with years of tension and regret. "You came," Daniel said, his voice low and controlled, as if he had been expecting this moment for a long time. Robert took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I couldn't keep running," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "I'm here now. We need to talk." Daniel turned slowly in his chair, his eyes locking onto Robert's. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air. "You never really understood, did you?" Daniel said, his voice almost mocking. "You thought you were helping me. You thought you were the one in control. But all along I've been the one pulling the strings." Robert took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you want from me? Why are you doing this?" Daniel's lips curled into a faint smile. "What I want from you is simple. I want you to finally see me for who I really am. I want you to understand the damage you've caused, the way you twisted my life even without realizing it." Robert shook his head. "You're the one who twisted your life, Daniel. I just tried to help you. I tried to make you see that you could be more than your past." Daniel's smile faded, and he stood up, walking slowly toward Robert. "You never understood," he repeated, his voice now tinged with anger. "You thought you could fix me, but you never saw the truth. You were just as broken as I was." The words stung more than Robert cared to admit. For years, he had thought of himself as someone who helped people, someone who made a difference. But in this moment, standing face to face with Daniel, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had built had been based on a lie. "Why didn't you tell me the truth, Daniel?" Robert asked, his voice quiet, almost pleading. "Why didn't you trust me enough to let me really help you?" Daniel's eyes darkened, and for a moment Robert saw something that chilled him to the bone, something primal, something unforgiving. "I didn't trust you because you were just another part of the system. You were the one who made me believe I had to fix myself, when all I really needed was to tear everything down." There was a long pause, the tension between them thickening. Robert could feel his chest tightening, his breath shallow. He had come here to confront Daniel, to understand the man who had manipulated him for so long. But now, standing here in the face of Daniel's anger, he realized the truth was much more complicated than he had ever imagined. "You've made your point, Daniel," Robert said quietly. "But I won't let you control me anymore. I won't let you destroy everything I've worked for." Daniel laughed, the sound cold and bitter. "You never had control, Robert. You never did." And with that, Daniel turned and walked out of the room, leaving Robert standing alone, facing the aftermath of everything that had led him here. Robert stood still for a moment, processing the conversation. Everything was falling apart, but he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of clarity. Daniel's manipulation, his games, they had all been designed to make Robert question himself, to make him doubt everything he had ever believed. But now, Robert knew one thing for certain. He had to fight back. He had to take control of his life once again, and no matter what it took, he would not let Daniel win. Robert stood in the silence of the office, the door still ajar behind him. His breath came heavy, his body trembling with the intensity of everything he had just faced. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in on him, constricting his thoughts, his emotions. He had come here to confront Daniel, to understand the man who had once been his patient and now had become something far more dangerous. But in that brief exchange, something had shifted. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered, were beginning to align in ways that Robert couldn't ignore. Daniel's words still echoed in his mind. You never understood. Was it true? Had Robert truly been so blind to the manipulation? Had his own arrogance and pride as a psychologist clouded his judgment all these years? He had helped so many people, but had he ever really helped anyone? Or was he just part of the system that kept people like Daniel trapped in their own cycles of pain? The questions gnawed at him, but there was no time to dwell on them. Robert had come to a realization, one that had been creeping up on him for weeks. Everything that had happened, everything he had endured, it had all been leading him to this point. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The truth was staring him in the face. He walked over to the desk where Daniel had been sitting just moments before. The papers on the desk were scattered, disorganized. But there, at the corner, was something that caught his eye, a piece of paper folded neatly. Without thinking, Robert picked it up and unfolded it, his eyes scanning the hastily scribbled message. The words were clear and chilling. The game is over, Robert. I've won. For a moment, Robert stood frozen, the weight of the words sinking in. He had been played. All this time, Daniel had been orchestrating everything. The letters, the challenges, the manipulation. It had all been part of a twisted game to force Robert to face his own demons. But there was more to it. Robert realized that Daniel wasn't the only one who had been manipulating him. He, too, had been manipulating himself. He sat down at the desk, his mind racing. The years he had spent in therapy, helping others, had come at a price. In trying to fix everyone else, he had lost sight of himself. The very things he had taught his patients, the lessons he had tried to instill in them, were lessons he had failed to apply to his own life. Daniel's game had been a mirror, reflecting Robert's own vulnerabilities, his own fears. But now, as Robert stared at the piece of paper in his hand, something within him shifted. He could feel it, an overwhelming sense of clarity, a feeling of release. He had been a part of the system that had failed Daniel, just as much as it had failed him. But he no longer had to be a part of that cycle. The phone on the desk buzzed, breaking the silence. Robert glanced at it, his heart pounding. It was a message from his secretary, a simple notification. Your next appointment is waiting. He stood up, his hands shaking, but his resolve stronger than it had been in years. For the first time, he didn't feel the weight of his past decisions bearing down on him. He felt free. The game was over, but it was no longer Daniel who had won. It was Robert. He had finally taken control of his own life. As Robert left the office, he glanced around one last time. The man who had once been trapped in the web of manipulation, both his own and Daniel's, was gone. In his place stood a man who had finally confronted the truth and was ready to face whatever came next with eyes wide open. The door closed behind him, and with it the chapter of his life that had been shaped by guilt, regret, and manipulation. He was free,